We've all been there. A speeding ticket. And not just any speeding ticket. A speeding ticket while on a trip abroad. And that comes with all kinds of problems, like late penalties and foreign language barriers, or government websites that only accept obscure ways of payment. It's time for a revolution. With PayTicket, your foreign parking ticket problems are a thing of the past. Simply input your information, such as name, email, and country of residence. Take a quick photo of your ticket, plug in your credit card details, and click Send. And PayTicket will take care of the rest. No matter what kind of traffic or parking violation you may have to pay, PayTicket makes it easier. Simple, fast, hassle-free. That's PayTicket.
That's all right. No, this is true.
Stunning video templates. Each video maker is carefully designed to look professional. Our video makers are super easy to use and let anyone with an internet connection create high quality videos in seconds. Edit logos, mockups, videos, and design templates with just a few clicks. Each template is carefully made by design experts, so your work will always look great. Get started with the best video maker at Plazy.net.
The case. It's a common problem among first and second year agents. Nothing to be ashamed of. Corey, tense in her seat, balled her fists below the table. Nothing made her angrier than being patronized. Well, except some jackass sexually harassing her, which had been a problem at the academy. Morwood's voice was quiet, even gentle, but the words cut her like a knife. This is a good object lesson, and one that everybody in this room either has learned or will learn soon enough. Focus on the case at hand, and don't chase after every circumstantial lead. He looked pointedly at her. Ask yourself, what could this Albert Parkin, who died in 1847 in the mountains of California, possibly have to do with the homicide of Frank Serbin in a Civil War cemetery almost 2 centuries later? Albert Parkin's remains haven't even been found yet. And you yourself said this excavation is being conducted by a highly accredited organization with all the required permits. Nothing like nighttime grave robbing. He took a deep breath. Corey could see he was about to draw the lesson for everyone in the room. There's an insidious danger we all face in our job today. Computers are too good at giving us information. We at the FBI are faced with an overwhelming deluge of data. It becomes difficult to determine which leads are valuable and which are just coincidence or wishful thinking. He paused to let this sink in. And so, what I'd suggest for your next action steps, Agent Swanson, is to continue the good work you've been doing. Continue the investigation into the Serbin homicide. And while you're doing that, Keep an eye, a distant eye, on this Parkin family connection. Watch for any other incidents involving the family line. Wait and see if that expedition in California ever finds the remains of Albert Parkin." He gave Corey a smile of encouragement along with an approving nod, but she could see the no in his eyes as well. Morwood then took a hearty gulp of coffee and turned to Wantagh. "All right, Agent," he said. "We're now ready for the next chapter in this thriller of yours." Chapter 17. Nora hiked back down Dollar Fork to Hackberry Creek, taking particular care, being on her own, not to slip on a rock or twist an ankle. She had to cross multiple times going downstream before she reached Poker Creek. By then, her feet were freezing and making a squelching sound with every step. The clouds were lifting, revealing a fresh snow line laid down by the storm. The line looked a lot closer than it had on the first day they packed in. She started up Poker Creek and in 40 minutes had reached the defile, then the wall of dead trees. Instead of looking for the profile of an old woman, she walked along the base of the cliff searching for freshly fallen rock that might indicate where the profile had once been. The job wasn't difficult. Rock had been falling for tens of thousands of years, leaving long scree slopes and boulders, but most of it was covered with lichen and buried in soil. The rock faces were riddled with cracks and holes. As she worked her way along, a pair of ravens flew overhead, cawing their displeasure. The air smelled of fir trees. A strange, icy feeling took hold as the mists once again descended, obscuring the peaks and turning the valley into a lake of ghostly mist. She reached the end of the valley and started back down the other side, almost immediately coming upon a fresher rockfall, recent enough that the trees it had knocked down could still be seen rotting among the broken rocks. She backed away and looked up. Along the edge of the bluff, below the line of melting snow, she spied an area of lighter, newly exposed rock where the canyon made a turn. This seemed an ideal vantage point for a stone face to be visible, if what was now rockfall had once resembled a face. She backed up further, sizing up the hollow with a practiced eye. The ground fell away from the valley edges, leveling out into a smoother area, smooth enough for a campsite. It was 3, maybe 4 acres, much larger than the archaeological site itself, which would probably occupy no more than 1/4 of an acre. So where exactly might they have pulled up the wagons? She tried to put herself in their heads. At the time, there was about 1 foot of snow on the ground, and it was falling fast, the leading edge of a blizzard that was about to alter their lives forever. The remote landscape had changed little, if at all, since 1846, and Nora knew that, except for the lack of snow, she was seeing much of what they would have seen. If she were leading the group, where would she have made camp? She moved about, walking a transverse first to the right, then to the left. Closer to the creek, the ground sloped down again. They would have stopped somewhere in the middle of the flat area. From which vantage point would the now fallen face have been seen best, the sharp granite corner most visible? It was hard to be sure, but after a bit of squinting up at the still snowy cliff, she settled on a spot that somehow felt right. The hollow was larger than it looked from a distance. The grass was wet from the rain here, thick and healthy. Unusually thick and healthy. And there were flowers. There were no flowers anywhere else in the damp meadow. As an archaeologist, she was trained to watch for areas of soil that were unexpectedly rich, or where there was a sudden change in vegetation. She knelt and pressed her hand into the icy grass. Should she? She was qualified, and they had all the proper permits. There was no reason not to. Kneeling, she took off her pack and removed an archaeological trowel, gloves, and a face mask from it. After measuring and cutting a 50-centimeter square in the thick grass cover, she edged the trowel underneath, working the roots loose, and lifted free the plate of grass to expose the muddy soil below. Slowly, with exquisite care, she began scraping back the layers of dirt, bit by bit. A 175-year-old site would not be far below the surface, especially at this high altitude, in a meadow where soil would have accumulated slowly. At 3 inches, the trowel tapped something. Changing to a light brush, she exposed the object. It was a tooth. When she returned to camp, the weather had fully cleared. The fleeting clouds tinged a blood red from the setting sun. The freshly whitened peaks were afire with alpenglow. Jason and Clive were still out, and Nora said nothing while Maggie cooked dinner and the wranglers fed the horses their evening oats. Finally, just as she was beginning to grow concerned, Jason appeared in camp. Clive followed, his face a mask of discouragement. "What a bust," he said, dumping his pack. He picked the ever-ready coffee pot off the fire and poured himself a cup, sitting down on the log. "No go, eh?" Clive shook his head. "Nothing at all? Really?" "Not so much as a button." Jason poured himself a cup as well. "Jason, what do you think?" Nora asked. He shrugged. "If there's a camp, it's not up Dollar Fork." Night was falling quickly, and Nora heard the hoot of an owl. She turned back to Clive. "Kind of selfish, don't you think?" He looked at her in incomprehension. "What? Who is?" "You! All this whining about what you didn't find. Why haven't you asked me what I found?" Both men turned. "You found something?" Clive asked. She nodded. "What?" "A human molar." Clive leapt to his feet. "No shit, really?" Everyone started talking at once, asking questions. "It was just over a mile up Poker Canyon, in that hollow we first explored." "Nora, my God, that's fantastic," said Clive, giving her a hug before recollecting himself, stepping back and shaking her hand vigorously. She was gratified and a little surprised by Clive's lack of envy that it was she, not he, who'd made the discovery. On top of that, she realized the hug had left her with a faint tingle. "Amazing! Phenomenal!" He sat down again, still laughing with joy, his blue eyes flashing. "Tell us how you did it." She briefly told the story while Burleson broke out a bottle of wine and poured glasses all around. "A toast," he said, holding up his tin cup. That bottle was followed by another, as Maggie served dinner. Afterward, they sat by the fire, and the conversation, consisting mostly of excited speculation, eventually fell off into silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the hooting of an owl, and the faint sigh of wind in the trees. "We'll move camp tomorrow," said Nora. "There's a flat area along Poker Creek only about half a mile down from the site." Burleson nodded. "I'll get Jack and Drew on it at first light." Again, they lapsed into silence, and then Jason sat up. "Did anyone hear that?" A long silence. Nora heard a knocking sound, very distant and faint. "There it is again," said Jason. "Woodpecker," said Clive. "They don't peck at night," said Maggie. "Sure they do. Don't they?" Another distant knocking sound, this time a little nearer. The wind sighed in the trees. "Anybody missing from the campfire?" Maggie asked. "Off answering nature's call?" "Nobody'd go that far," said Peel. They did a quick head count anyway. Everyone was accounted for. "Okay," said Maggie loudly into the darkness as she rose to her feet. "We know you're trying to scare us. Well, it worked. So show yourself, now that you've had your fun." They waited, and, as if on cue, there was another knock, followed by a low thump. Nora stood up and flicked on her headlamp. "Where are you going?" Maggie asked. "Out there to see what it is." Nora walked quickly across the verge of the meadow, ignoring the various voiced warnings from the campfire. She reached the tall trees and walked into the forest, the trunks like giant pillars in a cathedral, disappearing into the darkness above her. She paused and looked back. The glow of the fire was visible through the trunks. She walked farther, then paused to listen. Nothing but barely audible voices from the campfire, no doubt calling her back. Then the thumping sounded again, closer. It could be the wind, Nora thought, knocking two trees together. Or perhaps an elk moving about in the dark, rubbing its rack on tree trunks. The sound came again, and this time she zeroed in on the direction, walking fast through the trees, keeping to a straight line. After a few minutes, she stopped to listen once more. This, she judged, should be the approximate location of the sound. She waited and waited some more, but no sound came. Taking a few more steps, she passed through a particularly dense stand of trees and suddenly emerged into a roughly circular clearing. Odd. There was no reason for a break like this in such thick forest. She shone her light around, but there was nothing. Just a soft bed of green moss, undisturbed by tracks, and a few scattered boulders. She waited 5 minutes, but the sound did not return. She turned and began retracing her steps. Despite being an experienced woodsman, she hadn't marked her back trail, and in the dark, every trunk began to look the same as every other. Just as she was starting to panic, thinking she'd lost her way, she saw a faint gleam through the trees and headed for the welcoming fire. Chapter 18. May 8th. 2 mornings later, Nora stood near the base of the cliff and looked around. What had been an empty meadow the night before last was now a full-fledged archaeological excavation. And she had to admit, a damn fine one. The prep had gone like clockwork. Salazar and Adelsky had gridded out the central site, driving pegs into the ground at 1-meter intervals and tying day-glow orange string to create a 6 by 10-meter grid, each of the 60 grid spaces representing a square meter, from which every speck of soil would be removed and screened. The proton magnetometer, a device that looked like a high-tech lawnmower, had already been run over the entire area, giving them a rough idea where buried artifacts might be located, especially ferrous objects such as nails, bolts, and tools. Since this was a pristine area, free of human settlement, Nora assumed any ferrous object located in the ground must have been left by the Donner Party. And there were a lot, all concentrated in the middle of the hollow. That was probably where the hearth and the remains of the shelter would be found. Clive had pitched in with gusto, asking questions about how this worked or that, showing a keen interest in how archaeology was done and an eager desire to help. He was like an enthusiastic boy, really, thrilled to be on his first dig. Meanwhile, Maggie and the Wranglers were busy shifting their base camp from Hackberry Creek up Poker Canyon, just over half a mile from the site. Peel was leading the pack train to and from the ranch into the mountains on a daily basis. He would pack in equipment, overnight the animals in the campsite, and then lead them out again for another journey. Their living quarters had already been set up along the banks of the creek, and the move should be complete and everything in place by the following night. At the Lost Camp itself, a large wall tent, cheekily labeled HQ by Adelsky, had been set up adjacent to the archaeological site. It contained work tables and storage containers for sorting, photographing, and conserving the artifacts, along with a computer and Wi-Fi transmitter attached to solar panels and a small backup generator. The Wi-Fi couldn't connect them to the outside world, but it would be effective in communicating and transferring files among themselves. The strongbox went into a corner, and on the opposite side was an area for storing the proton magnetometer and other archaeological equipment. Adelsky and Salazar were at the far end of the meadow, finishing up the magnetometer survey. In the aftermath of the storm, the weather had been sublime, warm during the day and above freezing at night. As she watched, Clive emerged from the work tent and came over to where she was standing. "Beautiful morning," he said. "I'm really curious to see how this is going to progress. I've never worked on a dig before." We historians spend most of our time shut up inside libraries and archives, accumulating dust and withering away. Nora smiled. Nice shirt, she said, nodding at yet another Paisley horror show. How many of those did you bring? It's going to get awfully dirty, you realize. That is, if you're really serious about helping. Clive grinned, tugging on the collar. I know. I can't help it. I just like Paisley. But I am serious, really. We're partners, and I want to be useful, not just some bump on a log. Okay, I think that can be arranged. Nora thought back on how solitary her life had been since her husband's death, how used she had become to working alone. Well, perhaps it was time to engage with life a bit more. That's great, said Clive. He gestured at the snow-capped mountains. Sierra Nevada. Snowy mountains. They sure live up to their name. It's mid-May and they're still covered with snow. I can't believe how thrilling it is to be out here, working on this. He looked around. You think we should give this meadow a name? The same thought had occurred to Nora. She'd considered Tamsin's Meadow, but decided that wasn't suitable. Even in the early morning sunlight, the damp hollow held little charm. And it was not only because of what had happened here. The rocky walls seemed to loom over them almost menacingly. Where they narrowed at the far end, the cliffs were still topped by heavy scallops of snow. In particular, one vast lip of snow the size of an apartment building hung over the edge of a steep col high above them. It seemed to defy gravity, and she wondered what kept it in place. I guess that's one of the cornices Burleson warned us about, she said, nodding toward it. Good thing the dig site's nowhere near it. I wouldn't want to be under that baby when it gives. Nora continued her visual survey. The trees that formed the edge of the vale were dark and forbidding, cloaked in almost constant shadow, and many were partially or completely dead. At a low point near the end of the valley, the creek temporarily widened into a black, ice-skimmed tarn before continuing on its sinuous way. All in all, it was, not to put too fine a word on it, spooky. Let's call it Lost Meadow, Clive suggested. Nora considered this a moment. It seemed both simple and appropriate. Good idea. At that moment, they heard the distant voice of Maggie, calling them down to breakfast. Nora finished her bacon and eggs and gulped the last of Maggie's strong black coffee. Seated nearby, Salazar and Adelsky were both wolfing down their food. Now that the site was prepared, they knew what the day had in store. Serious work. She rose and put her plate in the dish tub. What do you say, Jason? She asked the field assistant. Ready to get dirty? Damn straight. He was on his feet in an instant. Count me in, said Clive. Moments later, the four of them, Nora, Salazar, Adelsky, and Clive, were headed back to the gridded-out dig site, Maggie wishing them good hunting at the top of her lungs. At the work tent, Nora picked up one of the iPads that ran the Institute's cutting-edge excavation app. As she fired it up, Clive came and looked over her shoulder. How does it work? She swiped open the app. It's pretty amazing. You input all the levels, soil types, and every artifact and its position. All you have to do is photograph the artifact, and the app maps it in situ using the picture. It stitches all the pictures together to create a complete dig site image, layer by layer. Amazing. Can you teach me? To use it? Sure, I'll show you the details. But you'll also need to know the rudiments of basic dirt archaeology. I'll show you as we go along. You can observe and follow what we do today, and maybe tomorrow I'll give you some actual work to do. Thank you. This is very exciting for me. History is always one step removed from the real thing. But right here, to be able to see and feel, it's so much more immediate, so real. It's like touching the past. You put your finger on exactly why I love archaeology, Nora said. She realized she would have to rein in his eagerness until she was sure she could trust his competence in field technique, but she was more than a little pleased at his lively interest. Nora motioned to Salazar and Adelsky. Grab your trowels and equipment and let's go. And don't forget gloves, hairnets, and face masks. Nora had worked out an exacting protocol for the excavation work, so as not to contaminate human remains with their own DNA. They connected their iPads to the local network and calibrated them. She assigned Salazar and Adelsky to 1-meter squares, then she herself took the grid in which she'd found the tooth, B3. Salazar's and Adelsky's squares were not adjacent to hers. She wanted to open the site in different places, get a feel for the broader outlines, develop a sense of where things were. As she put on her knee pads and knelt in the grass, Clive standing behind her, she felt butterflies in her stomach. This wasn't a typical site. It was where an unspeakable tragedy had occurred. The place was owed a certain reverence, and dealing with historic human remains, where there might be living descendants, there were living descendants, like the man whose shadow was half covering her as he looked over her shoulder, made it an entirely different story. Working carefully but efficiently, she removed the tarp from the sod layer she'd cut out 2 days before, labeled with a meter number, and examined the area of black earth where she'd found the tooth. She'd already discovered that the 1846 soil horizon was only 10 inches down, an incredibly shallow excavation. As she proceeded, she patiently explained each step to Clive. Taking the edge of her trowel, she gently removed soil a millimeter at a time, placing it in a bucket next to her, to be later dried and screened or put through flotation in search of carbonized organics and human hair. She could hear the 2 others starting on their squares. Scrape, dump. Scrape, dump. A moment later, her trowel touched something else. Once again, switching to a brush, she began to clean the surrounding area carefully. It's the top of a human cranium, she announced after a moment. Clive dropped to his knees and looked at it closely, his head almost touching hers. This gives me a really strange feeling, he murmured. Seeing these human remains. Me too. Salazar and Adelsky immediately came over. That didn't take long. Nora brushed it off, exposing it to the edges. It was a piece about the size of 2 silver dollars, discolored brown edging to a crumbling whitish powder, crazed with fractures. She worked ever so slowly, uncovering more of the skull. Her work revealed the forehead, eye sockets, and nasal opening, along with the mandible that had held her initial discovery, the tooth. Probably male, from the brow ridges, she murmured. They all watched in focused silence as she continued. That's the coronal suture, she said, pointing with the tip of her brush at a squiggly line running through the bone. I'm no physical anthropologist, but I'd guess from its state of fusing this skull belonged to an adult. There was a silence. The Lost Camp, according to my census, had 7 male adults, said Clive, his voice low. A 17-year-old, 3 in their 20s, 2 in their 30s, and 1 who was 40. But Boardman, who was in his late 20s, escaped to the Donner camp, and the 40-year-old, Cheers, was eventually rescued. So it couldn't be either of them. I'd guess this was one of the 30-year-olds. Clive squatted closer. Can you tell anything else from looking at it? Nora took a deep breath. See these marks here and here? She fished out a loop and allowed him to examine them closely. Those look like anvil strike markings. They're one of the 6 classic signs of cannibalism. The kind of scratches caused by a skull being placed on a rock and bashed open with another rock. Clive shook his head in faint horror. She pointed at another spot. And here we have a second classic sign. The crumbling edge on this bone could only have been the result of heating and cooking. She sat back, This person was decapitated, his head put in a fire and cooked, and the brain pan was bashed open to get at the, cooked brain. This was greeted by a brief silence. "Glad I kept my hands off that bacon at breakfast," said Salazar. "Brings it home pretty strong, doesn't it?" said Clive. "So, what are the other 4 signs of cannibalism?" "Scraping marks inside the bone to get out the marrow, butcher marks made by stone or metal tools, the mashing of spongy bone to extract the nourishment, and pot polish." "Pot polish?" "That's where broken bones are boiled in a ceramic or iron pot to extract the grease. As they turn in the boiling water, the sharp ends become microscopically polished by the sides of the pot." She paused. "Back in the lab, a physical anthropologist will examine these bones under a stereo zoom." She stood up. "There's probably a lot more of it, him, to be found in this immediate area." She hesitated. "Let me excavate just a little more before deciding on our next move." She knelt and began to work again, with Clive, Adelsky, and Salazar watching. Almost immediately, she uncovered 2 more pieces of cranium and the burnt rim of the orbit. There were no vertebrae connected to the skull, but next to be exposed was a femur and what appeared to be a humerus. "I'm no archaeologist, but the density of stuff is surprising," Clive said. "I thought it would be more spread out. But it looks like a jumble, those skulls and long bones." He shook his head. "Well, I hate to put it this way," Nora said, "but the area we're working in appears to be a midden heap, where food trash was tossed." "As in a lot of cannibalized bodies?" "Yes." She stood up again. "Jason, Bruce, under the circumstances, I think you should leave your assigned quads for now and concentrate on the quads adjacent to this one, starting with B4 and A3. If this is a midden heap, it's where the biggest cache will be." The men nodded and moved off to collect their equipment. Nora stepped back from the immediate work site and Clive followed her. "Ever worked on a site like this before?" Clive asked. "In a way, yes. I worked on a site years ago that held the remains of young people murdered back in the 19th century by a serial killer. And I helped excavate a major prehistoric Pueblo cannibal site in Utah. That's where I met my husband." "I didn't know you were married." "My husband, Bill. Well, he died." "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." He took her hand spontaneously. She thought of withdrawing it, but didn't. There was nothing more in the gesture than friendly concern, she told herself. "I'm working on getting over it." She didn't want to tell him it had been more than 7 years. In the past months, she thought she'd finally gotten over the worst of Bill's death, but his memory and the hurt always seemed to resurface when she least expected it. "I lost a girlfriend," Clive said. "Fiancé, actually. Pancreatic cancer. Caught too late, as it so often is. In 2 months, she was gone." "How terrible. I'm so sorry." You grow up thinking everything's fine and bad things happen to other people, and then, out of the blue, life drops a piano on you. I couldn't believe the pain, and the surprise. She nodded. He had been through it too, and yet he seemed to be getting over it. "When did that happen?" 2 years ago. It feels like yesterday, but we move forward, right? We do what we have to do to continue our lives." Again, she nodded. He was still holding her hand. After a long period of quiet, he gave it a friendly squeeze and released it. "Nora," he said, "I'm ready. I'd love to have my own grid to work on." She hadn't expected the conversation to take this sudden turn. "Clive, I'm not sure. You taught me a lot last night, and I've learned more just from watching you today." A couple hours of observation might not be enough. I promise I'll be slow and super careful. And if I find anything, I'll immediately let you know. Nora mulled this over. Look, my own ancestors, the Breens, were on this mountain. Patrick and Peggy Breen had 7 children, ages 1 to 14. They overcame their scruples for their children's sake and fed them human flesh. They were the only family that didn't have a death, and forever after, they were marked. Those are the kids who lived on human flesh. It seems horrible, I know, but if their son Edward hadn't resorted to cannibalism, I wouldn't be here. He was my great-great-great-grandfather. He took a deep breath. Now that we've found these remains, I find I just want to delve in, be part of this, get my paisley shirt really, really dirty. Nora couldn't help smiling. She knew exactly how he felt. Even so, she wasn't going to take too big a chance. She consulted her iPad. Perhaps she could assign him a square in the most distant quadrant of the meadow, closest to the woods, where he was least likely to find anything of significance. Or, for that matter, do any damage. E10 would be a good place for him to start. The proton magnetometer had registered something in this area, but it was faint and far from the main scene of action. Okay, she said. If you promise to take it slow, no deeper than 10 inches, please, and stop to notify me the moment you find anything, even so much as a pebble. I promise. You can take grid E10. Nora put her iPad aside. Come on, get a mask and gloves, and I'll show you where it is. Chapter 19. The discoveries were so exciting and coming so thick and fast that nobody wanted to stop for lunch, so Nora just let them keep going while the afternoon lengthened. At first, she checked on Clive every half hour, but when it was clear he was doing a slow and painstakingly methodical job, she decided he could be left to his own devices. Thanks to the joint efforts of Salazar and Adelsky, the Midden Heap was yielding up more and more artifacts. Not only a third skull and numerous other human bones, but scraps of clothes, buttons, lockets, and jewelry. Everything was carefully tagged and logged, and situated using the suite of powerful archaeological software on their tablets. Salazar pointed out that here and there the Midden Heap showed signs of animal disturbance, but it looked old, probably dating back to the tragedy. And after a brief conference, they came to the conclusion that these were most likely the result of brief scavenging attempts after the first spring thaw. Nora knew there would not be many animals at this altitude, and in any case, what bones remained would have been covered in dust, dirt, and grass soon enough. It was around 3:30, with a gorgeous afternoon just beginning to settle toward evening, the sun hanging low over the snowy mountains and bathing them in light, when Clive came over to the square that Nora was carefully photographing. "Have you got a minute?" he asked. "I'd like to show you something." His voice was calm, but there was a curious expression on his face that she hadn't seen before. "Sure." She slung the camera around her neck and followed him over to the far end of the dig site, away from the others. Here, in these grids farthest from the main camp, the ground was already under the shadow of the pine trees. A late breeze swept through the meadow, rippling the fresh grass and bringing with it the scent of flowers. Nora saw that Clive had excavated the square she'd assigned him, E10, down to 10 inches, and finding nothing, having secured and documented it in the manner she'd demonstrated, he had moved on to the adjoining square, E9. It was toward this that he pointed. Nora knelt for a closer look. Clive had carefully removed the carpet of grass in a single section and excavated down no more than 2 inches. Something wrinkled and rough was protruding from the soil. At first, Nora thought it might be a saddle or the hide of some animal. But a closer look revealed it was the rotting remains of an old boot. Peering even more closely, she could see toe bones peeking out from within. "It was so near the surface," he explained, "that I barely did more than remove the grass. A few whisks of the broom and the earth just fell away." Nora examined it from various angles. "Might be a burial," she said. "Or it might have just been left where the man died. The boot leather is the one thing nobody would have eaten. Even a starving person knew it was madness to eat the only thing protecting you from the cold and snow." "Makes sense. But that's not what I brought you here to see." He knelt down beside her. "This is." And, taking up a paintbrush, he turned to a small mound of disturbed dirt at one side of the ancient boot. Nora watched as the first whisk of the brush exposed a small leather bag, bound with a thong and crumbling into dust. A second gentle whisk revealed where the bag had rotted and split. It revealed the glint of gold. For a minute, Nora just stared at it. Then she looked at Clive. "Once I'd discovered what it was, I covered it back up," he explained. "I wanted you to see it before anyone else did." Nora glanced over her shoulder. Salazar and Jason were on the far side of the old camp, busy with the midden. She looked at Clive. Normally, one didn't cover something back up unless it was at the conclusion of the dig. But in this case, she nodded her approval. "What we need to do next is figure out exactly what you've discovered," she said, "and get it out of the ground and under lock and key." Taking over from Clive, she gently excavated the rest of the square. The earth was just as soft and yielding as Clive had said it was, and within half an hour, she'd exposed the lower legs, feet, and crumbling leather boots of what appeared to be 2 adult men lying side by side, positioned away from the gridded area. Neither the foot bones, the tibias, nor the fibulas showed any sign of dismemberment or cannibalism. In the boots, each man had hidden a pouch of coins. After carefully photographing and recording them in situ, Nora removed the 2 pouches and placed them on a small conservator's tarp nearby. "Hey!" Nora looked over quickly. It was Salazar, waving from the midden heap. "We never ate our lunches. Can we secure things and call it a day?" She glanced over at Clive. He met her glance, shrugged. "Bruce, Jason, you finished your quads?" "Yup." "Uploaded all your survey and coordinate data?" "Sure have." "Go ahead then. Stow your gear and head back. Clive and I will close up the site. You can shut down the network, too. I won't have any more data to add today." "Okay. Tell Maggie to save some dinner for us. We won't be long." As the 2 assistants took off their masks, hairnets, and gloves and began to stow their tools, Nora and Clive returned to the moldering leather pouches. Using a thin pair of forceps and a loop, Nora pried gently at one. It immediately fell apart, revealing 5 pieces of gold. With a gloved hand, Clive picked up one of the coins by the edges and turned it around. Even covered with dust and soil, it glinted in the sun. "It's a $10 gold eagle," he said. He peered closer. "Looks uncirculated, save for a high degree of bag marks. Struck in 1846, from the Philadelphia Mint." "Wolfinger's treasure?" Nora asked. Taking the forceps from Nora, Clive teased open the remains of both bags. They each held 5 $10 gold pieces, virtually identical. "The year's right," he said. "The mint is right. It's just the number that's wrong. There aren't 1,000 here, only 10. After all this, you're the last one I'd figure for a pessimist." Clive broke into a smile. "Pessimist? With those coins winking back at me? I don't know about you, but that's what I'd call proof. Now let's find the rest." "If it's here." "It will be," said Clive. "Think about it. These two were already suspected of foul play. They were ostracized, not allowed to join the others in their shelter. So they made their own little camp here and hid their gold somewhere close by. Don't you agree?" Nora felt a little uncomfortable speculating like this, but she couldn't fault Clive's logic. "I agree." She picked up the broom and the trowel and went to work on the site, moving quickly but expertly, wasting no time but missing nothing. Within an hour, she had both skeletons exposed as far as their rib cages. Not only that, but she had uncovered some exceedingly rotten planks that appeared to be the remains of a small, crude shelter made from wagon pieces. She sat back on her haunches while Clive used her camera to photograph the exposed portions of the skeletons and the pieces of wood. "Well," she asked, "what do you think?" "You're the archaeologist. You're the historian. But okay. 2 individuals, both in their 30s, as best I can tell. Their skulls aren't exposed yet, so I can't be sure of the sex. But they appear to be male. No signs of violence so far. No cannibalism either. Based on the fact that there are 2 of them placed here together, away from the main group, and judging by the gold on their persons, specifically 1846 $10 gold eagles hidden in their boots, I would say they are almost certainly Reinhardt and Spitzer. All that's missing is the gold, and like I said, they would have hidden it around here somewhere." Growing more animated, Clive added, "Nora, think what we've accomplished. We've been here less than a week, and look, not only this." He gestured at the money pouches. "But the lost camp. The lost camp. And we found it. Or rather, you found it." Nora considered herself an old hand at dirt archaeology, and she'd found several important sites over the years. But this sudden enthusiasm? This praise by an amateur? Not an amateur, actually, but a historian who'd made this very discovery his life's work? Left her blushing with pleasure. Without speaking further, they wrapped up the remains of the coin purses and their contents and placed them in an artifact container, secured the grids and exposed skeletons with tarps and fixed them carefully in place, returned to the HQ tent and placed the coins in the strongbox, and then headed down the trail toward the campsite and dinner. Chapter 20. May 9th. Shortly after lunch the following day, Nora took a break from working in the dirt. She, Clive, Adelsky, and Salazar had focused on the Spitzer and Reinhardt site all morning. After explaining the discovery to the 2 assistants, Nora had finished exposing the skeletons, while the others had extended the excavations on either side, stretching out another meter into undisturbed ground. They had taken the entire area down to the 1847 soil horizon and even farther, in case the gold had been buried right at the site. But so far they had found nothing. No gold or any signs of a burial. Only ragged scraps of clothing and a few buttons. After lunch, Clive and the 2 assistants continued to work in that area. But Nora decided to take a break. Over the course of her career, she had discovered that, from time to time, she had to stop and let an archaeological site speak to her. Just speak. In the midst of digging, sometimes she got so focused on a square meter of dirt that she would start losing the overall story that the site was trying to tell her. That had happened while searching for the gold, and she had to remind herself that it was only a small part of the archaeological treasures the site was yielding. So now she laid down her trowel and wandered about the site, shutting down the intellectual side of her brain, pushing out thoughts of gold, and letting the history rise from the earth, as one of her professors had put it. She tried to recreate in her mind the conditions of the site, the drifting snow, the bleak cliffs, the absolute wilderness, and how the people stranded in it were focused on one thing: survival. As she drew in the mountain air and looked around, she got a taste of the strangeness, the isolation they must have felt. Today, they were a mere 15 miles from a major interstate highway, yet it still felt like the ends of the earth. In 1847, the travelers would have been farther from civilization than anything conceivable today. As she wandered around, her footsteps took her to an area down by the creek, the row of parallel grids labeled F that were farthest from the Hackberry Trail. Here, in one isolated spot, the magnetometer had registered a small shadow, something unnatural, in or around grid F2. For some reason, this spot spoke to Nora. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she was attracted to it because the place was more pleasant than most in the valley. She had not opened up this grid yet, but she felt it might contain something special, even important. It whispered to her professional instincts of history, of stories long hidden, waiting to be told. And there was something about untouched ground, before the first trowel had bit into the dirt, that seemed almost magical. Most important, it would take her mind off the search for Wolfinger's gold. Carefully, she prepared to excavate F2. As she worked, she could hear the low chatter of Adelsky and Salazar floating down from higher ground, where they were finishing up the Spitzer and Reinhardt section, still with no success. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see Clive. He'd wandered away from Adelsky and Salazar and was standing near the far line of trees, hands in his pockets, looking skyward, apparently lost in thought. As she began work on the grid, carefully sweeping the dirt away, a shadow fell over her. She turned to see Clive, hands still in his pockets. "Decided to try your luck over here?" he asked. Nora wiped her forehead with the back of one glove, then nodded. "Mind if I watch?" "Not at all." Clive squatted beside her, careful not to disturb any of the grid lines. He pulled out one of his cigars and lit it up. "Do you mind?" Nora said, pointing downwind. "Oh, sorry." Clive changed position. "I used to be a cigarette fiend, 3 packs a day. So I switched to cigars, these expensive Dunhills, hoping the cost would keep my habit down." "That's only the second one I've seen you smoke." "Yeah, I've cut back over the last couple of years. Now I only smoke to relax, calm my nerves, that kind of thing." For about 5 minutes, he watched her work. And then he shook his head. "I've been thinking." He stopped. "Thinking what?" "What a goddamn idiot I've been." Nora stopped working and sat back on her heels. "Care to tell me why?" "Those two, Reinhardt and Spitzer, were carrying the gold in their boots. Why?" "Why do you think?" "Because that's all the fucking treasure they had." Clive said this in a low, bitter voice, eyes on the ground. It was the first time Nora had heard him use such profanity. "And how do you figure that?" "You and I both agree they would have kept the gold close. Well, we just excavated their entire miserable hovel and found nothing." "Maybe they hid it beneath a nearby tree," Nora said. "Or buried it in the snow." Clive shook his head. "That's not what my gut tells me." Nora could hardly believe what she was hearing. "But Clive, it was you who did the historical research on all this. It was impeccable. You laid it all out, for me and Dr. Fugit, back in her office. Wolfinger withdrew that gold." Clive puffed on his cigar. All I found was a withdrawal note. Its details in regards to Wolfinger are technically debatable. But still, we know there was a robbery and murder. Sure, by a couple of jackasses who got $100 for their trouble. When we first found those coins, I said they looked uncirculated, although with heavier bag marks than usual. But I've thought about that some more. If I'm honest with myself, I have to admit that's not the case. They're scratched, dinged up, far beyond what any bag marks would cause. And do you know why? Because Reinhardt and Spitzer had been walking around with those coins in their boots ever since they killed Wolfinger. But, Nora began, then stopped when she saw the expression on his face. They murdered him expecting a fortune, and found only 10 gold pieces. Not exactly chump change in 1847, but no treasure either. It's exactly from such things that legends are born. And this particular legend was just credible enough to gull this particular historian. Clive, what makes you think that gold isn't hidden somewhere else? Nora began, but Clive cut her off. Put yourself in their shoes for a moment. Think about what you would do. Nora thought. I suppose I wouldn't have let it out of my sight. Exactly. I made a fatal mistake. I'm a trained historian, and I should have been more careful. I have no excuse. What mistake, exactly? Excuse for what? For making an assumption. I assumed Wolfinger made that withdrawal. But Nora, the fact is those bank records were incomplete. Dr. Fugit was right to be skeptical. Sure, Wolfinger made a withdrawal that week, but it was for $100. The other $900 must have gone out in other withdrawals, lost in the bank's incomplete records. That's why Reinhardt and Spitzer divided the gold equally between them, 5 coins apiece. That's why it was in their boots. And that's why I've let you down. As he'd done earlier, he looked up at the sky. Nora, I'm ashamed. I guaranteed the Institute we'd find that gold, and instead all we have is 10 lousy coins. Nora was silent a moment. Listening to Clive talk, she felt something she hadn't expected. Regret. As an archaeologist, she'd always told herself that gold, treasure, didn't matter. After all, she wasn't going to get any of it. Here she was, surrounded by the real treasure, an important archaeological discovery. And yet, despite her best efforts, she too was experiencing more than a pang of disappointment. She pushed these thoughts away. Those 10 coins are still worth a lot of money, she said. Not enough to fund this expedition, Clive said. And they're not uncirculated. Their historical value might up the price a little, but they're still only worth $1,000 each, perhaps a bit more. Maybe so, but don't you see? We were never sure we'd find that gold. And the fact is, it doesn't matter anymore. We found the lost camp. That's what's important. This is going to be such a coup for the Institute that Dr. Fugit will probably be able to raise a lot of money based on the site alone. I hope she can, Clive said. But that doesn't change the fact that I let you down. He dropped his half-finished cigar and ground it out in the grass. Better take that away with you. Of course, sorry. Clive wrapped the cigar stub in a tissue. Here I've interrupted your work, feeling sorry for myself. Go ahead. Let's see what's in this grid. Nora took the whisk and began brushing her way down through the soft soil, removing it with the trowel for later screening. Almost immediately, she felt the whisk encounter an obstruction. She set the whisk aside and resumed work with a paintbrush, brushing in a gentle semicircular motion. A delicate human jawbone appeared. The maxilla. Tiny, Clive said. "It's a child," said Nora. "See the baby teeth? I'd estimate this came from a person 6 to 8 years old." Her voice faltered. In a moment, all thought of the gold was gone. "There was only one child of that age in the group," Clive murmured, peering closely. Working slowly with something close to reverence, Nora continued to brush dirt away from the jaw, freeing it from the earth that had held it prisoner for more than a century and a half. "Why don't you take pictures while I work to document this?" she murmured. Clive photographed the jaw from a number of angles. Soon the rest of the skull appeared. It was intact. Quietly, as if sensing an important discovery, Adelsky and Salazar had left their quads and come to observe. Working downward, Nora began uncovering cervical vertebrae and a small rib cage. A silver hair clasp appeared, in the shape of a ribbon, with a lock of blonde hair wedged in it. Seeing this, she paused. The others were looking on, mesmerized. She could feel the intensity of their gaze as they stared at what were quite clearly the remains of Samantha Carville, the only child in the lost camp. The skeleton was lying on its back, skeletal arms folded lovingly across the chest. Clive broke the silence. "Amazing her hair survived all these years." "It's the cold," Salazar said. "And the altitude." Suddenly, Nora realized both her legs had gone to sleep. She stood up with effort, massaging her calves. As she did so, she was startled to notice that someone was standing behind them, at the edge of the clearing. It was Jack Peel. They had all been so focused on the discovery that they hadn't heard his approach. He was wearing a cowboy hat and a long duster, and was staring at them intently. Nora pulled off her gloves and waved. Adelsky did the same. For a moment, Peel stood there, half obscured by shadow. At this distance, his expression was unreadable. Then he raised a hand in acknowledgement, turned, and disappeared into the gloom of the trees, duster billowing behind him as he headed back to camp. "He's an odd one," said Clive. Adelsky and Salazar went back to their own tasks, and Nora continued working, assisted by Clive, until she had finished the quadrant. At last, she put aside her tools and sighed. A pair of ravens cawed back and forth between two dead trees. A mist began settling down as evening darkened the sky. She gazed upon the delicate skeleton, with its silver clasp and tight braid of golden hair. Only the top part of Samantha was exposed in this quad. The body below the waist ran into the next quad, which Nora had not yet opened. That would be a job for tomorrow. She reached over, grabbed a tarp, unfurled it,